Megan stood in the center of her pristine Victorian kitchen, her breath hitching as she watched the smart fridge screen flicker. A new notification appeared in the corner. Heart rate elevated. "Would you like me to dim the lights, Megan?" The mechanical voice echoed through the empty house, followed by the soft, synchronized click of every motorized deadbolt in the mansion engaging at once. High in the corner of the ceiling, the glass eye of a security camera swiveled with a predatory whir, its red status light bleeding into the shadows of the hallway. She lunged for the heavy oak front door, her fingers white-knuckled as she yanked the handle. But it remained a solid, unmoving wall. Outside, on the gravel driveway, her husband Graham stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed against the twilight. He didn't reach for his keys or look toward the windows. He simply raised his smartphone, his thumb hovering over the screen as he watched his wife's frantic reflection in the glass. When he finally looked up, his face was a mask of calm, professional concern. Even as he tapped a command that cut the Wi-Fi and plunged the entire house into a suffocating, high-tech silence. Megan Caldwell adjusted the high collar of her cashmere cardigan, the soft fabric offering little comfort against the chill of the consulting office. She slid the heavy leather chair forward, its base groaning against the hardwood floor, until she sat directly across from the teenager slumped in the visitor's seat. The boy's fingers danced a frantic, silent rhythm against his denim thighs, his gaze anchored to a loose thread on the rug. Megan watched him, her brown eyes softening with a professional empathy that had become her shield. She recognized that specific tremor in his hands, the vibration of a person who felt watched even in a locked room. In this small office on the edge of Asheville, surrounded by motivational posters and the gentle hum of a lavender diffuser, Megan was the authority, the protector. Yet, as she leaned in to offer a reassuring word, the weight of her own Victorian mansion on the hill pressed against her spine. She was an expert at guiding young professionals through the labyrinths of their careers and anxieties, but the irony tasted like copper in her mouth. She could map out a stranger's path to freedom while her own world was shrinking to the size of a polished, high-tech cage. The afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the thick, velvet drapes of the Caldwell estate as Megan stood in the center of the master bedroom. She reached for the Mother's Day bracelet on her wrist, spinning the gold chain until it bit into her skin. Graham would be home soon. She could almost hear the hum of his Lexus pulling into the gravel driveway, a sound that usually triggered a frantic mental checklist. Were the pillows fluffed to his exacting standards? Was the scent of the house neutral, devoid of the clutter of cooking smells? She moved to the vanity, applying a layer of foundation to hide the faint freckles on her nose. Graham found them unrefined. Her life was a series of adaptations, a continuous performance curated for an audience of one. She was a career consultant who had surrendered her own career to his whims, a woman who broke dishes in the basement just to hear the sound of something shattering under her own agency. In the quiet sanctuary of a corner cafe, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and old paper, Megan huddled over a steaming cup of tea. The porcelain was warm against her palms, a stark contrast to the cold dread pooling in her stomach. Ellen Wilson leaned across the small table, her auburn bob shimmering under the dim amber lights. The human rights lawyer didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a thick manila folder across the wood, her voice a low, urgent rasp that barely rose above the hiss of the espresso machine. Megan's eyes tracked the highlighted paragraphs, legal jargon that translated to a singular, terrifying reality: involuntary guardianship. Ellen's finger traced a line of text, explaining that Graham was meticulously documenting Megan's instability. He was collecting records of fabricated panic attacks and erratic behavior, weaving a net of clinical observations to present to a judge. Megan felt a literal chill crawl up her vertebrae when Ellen whispered the date of the first preliminary hearing. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the handle of her teacup. Graham wasn't just trying to control her schedule anymore. He was moving to legally erase her autonomy, turning her very existence into a jurisdictional cell. A few hours later, Megan stood at the polished mahogany counter of a boutique downtown, the smell of expensive leather and perfume cloying in her throat. She offered her gold card to the cashier with a practiced, elegant smile. The terminal emitted a sharp, discordant beep. A rejection. Megan's heart skipped. She produced a second card, then a third, but the result remained a flat, digital refusal. Outside, the street was whipped by a biting North Carolina wind. She stepped toward an ATM, the screen glowing a harsh, mocking blue as it displayed a contact financial institution error. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was a message from Graham. "I noticed some unusual activity on the accounts, darling. Given your recent exhaustion, I've moved everything to a protected trust for your peace of mind. Let's discuss your needs tonight." Megan stood frozen on the sidewalk, the wind stinging her eyes. He had done it. He had severed her veins. She was standing in the middle of a bustling American city, surrounded by wealth, and she couldn't even buy a ticket to leave it. The glow of the laptop screen cast a ghostly, blue light over Megan's face in the darkness of the library. It was late. The house silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. She had bypassed the parental controls Graham installed, her fingers trembling as she navigated to her professional emails sent folder. There, she found a ghost trail of her own destruction. Graham had sent a series of BCC'd emails to the partners at Horizon Pathways and her top-tier clients. His prose was masterful, dripping with the deepest regret and heartbreaking concern for his wife's fragile psychological state. He advised them to disregard any frantic outreach from her, attributing her potential pleas for work or help to the side effects of new, heavy medication. Megan read the replies from her colleagues, expressions of sympathy, promises to give her the space she needs to heal. Her reputation, built over a decade of diligent work, was being dismantled by a man in a silk robe sitting in the next room. He wasn't just taking her money. He was stealing her voice. Silence was the only currency Megan had left. She moved through the darkened hallway of the mansion, her bare feet sinking into the plush wool runners. Every floorboard was a potential traitor, every shadow a witness. She reached the heavy oak door of Graham's study, the scent of expensive tobacco and furniture wax greeting her like a physical barrier. She eased the door open and slipped inside, the air metallic and still. Her breath hitched as she lifted the lid of his laptop, the sudden flare of the monitor feeling like a spotlight in the gloom. With a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, she fumbled a thumb drive into the side port. The progress bar for the financial data transfer crawled with agonizing slowness. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of his heavy tread on the stairs or the click of a light switch. The house seemed to breathe with her, the ticking of the clock downstairs sounding like the rhythmic fall of a hammer. Each percentage point on the screen felt like a drop of blood returning to her body, until finally, the encrypted files of Graham's secret ledgers were hers. The sudden, sharp click of the door handle sent a jolt of pure electricity through Megan's nerves. She spun around, the thumb drive clutched so tightly in her palm the plastic edges bit into her skin. Graham stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted by the dim hall light, his silk robe hanging off his broad shoulders like a regal shroud. He didn't move. His gray eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, his wife standing by his desk in the middle of the night. Megan's mind raced, a frantic bird hitting the walls of a cage. She shoved her hand with the drive behind her back and, with the other, snatched a thick, leather-bound volume of Dickens from the shelf. She forced a tired, watery smile onto her face. I couldn't sleep, Graham. The insomnia. I just needed something to quiet my head. She held the book up like a shield. Graham remained motionless, his gaze drifting from her face to the closed laptop and back again. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a wire about to snap. The air heavy with the unspoken accusation he was waiting for her to confirm. Morning light flooded the grand staircase, but it felt clinical rather than warm. Megan paused halfway down, her eyes fixed on the ceiling corners. Overnight, Graham had installed black, glossy domes, security cameras, at every junction. The tiny red power lights felt like unblinking, predatory eyes tracking her movement. Graham appeared at the top of the stairs, casually knotting his tie and whistling a light, jaunty tune. He caught her stare and offered a thin, sharp smile. For your safety, Megan. Given your recent episodes, I can't risk you hurting yourself when I'm at the office. He spoke as if he were discussing a new home insurance policy. Megan felt the walls of the mansion physically tighten around her. Even the path to the bathroom was now a recorded event, a data point for his growing dossier. As he brushed past her, his hand briefly squeezed her shoulder. A gesture that felt less like affection and more like a rancher branding a prized heifer. Later that afternoon, Megan's friend Sarah sat on the velvet sofa in the morning room, her expression a mask of pity. Megan tried to steer the conversation toward their usual topics: the upcoming gallery opening, the summer trip to the coast. But Sarah kept interrupting. She reached out, her hand soft and heavy on Megan's knee. Megan, James and I have been talking to Graham. He's so worried about you. Sarah began a rehearsed monologue about the wonders of modern psychiatry and the gentle benefits of new sedatives. Megan watched her friend's lips move, realizing with a sickening jolt that the poison had already spread. Graham had spent hours on the phone with their social circle, painting a picture of a woman slipping into a delusional fog. Every word Megan spoke now was being filtered through the lens of a clinical symptom. Her last ally had been recruited into Graham's army of well-meaning jailers, and Sarah looked at her not as a peer, but as a patient who didn't know she was sick. Megan grabbed her coat from the brass rack, her fingers fumbling for the heavy brass handle of the front door. She needed air. She needed to see the street, to feel the American pavement beneath her feet. But a broad figure in a dark, nondescript suit stepped into her path. The man was a stranger, a private security guard with a face like granite. He didn't look her in the eye, but his arm was a solid bar across the doorframe. Mr. Caldwell has requested that you remain indoors today, ma'am, for your protection. Megan looked up and saw Graham standing on the second-floor gallery, his hands resting calmly on the railing. He didn't say a word, just watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of a scientist. The heavy thud of the door closing echoed through the foyer like a tomb being sealed. The Victorian beauty of the house had finally vanished, leaving only the gilded bars of a cage where every exit was now a privilege he had revoked. In the sterile white light of the master bathroom, Megan opened a familiar orange prescription bottle, expecting the yellow vitamin capsules she took every morning. Instead, a handful of small, chalky white tablets spilled into her palm. There was no manufacturer's marking, no familiar imprint, just a sharp, chemical scent of bitterness. She looked up and saw Graham's reflection in the mirror. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her with a terrifyingly placid expression. "It's a new compound, Megan. Dr. Hampton recommended it to help with your sleep cycles. You've been so restless." His voice was a low, soothing hum that made the hair on her arms stand up. He didn't move, waiting for her to take the water glass he had already placed on the vanity. The air in the tiny room felt thick with the smell of bleach and the unspoken threat that he would stay there until she complied, surrendering the last of her consciousness to his chemistry. Dinner was a silent affair, the only sound the rhythmic scrape of Graham's knife against his steak. He reached across the white linen and picked up Megan's smartphone, his long, manicured fingers navigating the screen with practiced ease. Megan watched, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, as he accessed the home's router settings. With a single, casual tap, he deleted her device from the network. The screen of her phone went black, the Wi-Fi bars vanishing into a void. "Digital detox, darling," he said, placing the dead device back on the table like a piece of discarded trash. "The blue light and the constant notifications are fueling your anxiety. You'll thank me when your head finally clears." Megan stared at the useless slab of glass. She was now truly isolated. No phone, no internet, no way to reach Ellen or the world beyond the duocs and rhododendrons that ringed the estate. Beneath the mattress of the guest room bed, a hidden, aging tablet vibrated with a faint, blue light. Megan pulled it out, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was an encrypted message from Ellen. "Hampton is coming tomorrow. Graham's paid him to sign the commitment papers. He's going to do the evaluation in your living room at 9 a.m. Be ready." The words blurred before Megan's eyes. This was the endgame. Graham wasn't just taking her assets. He was preparing to physically remove her from society, using a corrupt doctor to provide the legal veneer for her disappearance. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of Graham's footsteps on the oak floorboards, approaching the bedroom. She shoved the tablet back into its hiding place and scrambled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin just as the door handle began to turn. Megan bolted the bathroom door and turned the brass taps until the roar of the water filled the small space, masking the sound of her own ragged breathing. She leaned over the sink, staring at the woman in the mirror. The face looking back was pale, the eyes wide and rimmed with the red lines of exhaustion. But beneath the fear, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to crystallize. She pressed her ice-cold palms to her cheeks, forcing the muscles of her jaw to relax, smoothing the frantic lines on her forehead. She practiced the expression Graham demanded, the vacant, compliant gaze of a woman who had finally stopped fighting. She had to be perfect. She had to be the ghost he wanted her to be. Just long enough to find the one crack in the fortress he had built around her. The morning air felt heavy as Megan pulled a thick craft paper envelope from the narrow slot of the mailbox. The sun was barely up, casting long skeletal shadows across the driveway. Her fingers felt numb, the skin prickling as she tore through the adhesive strip. Inside, a sheet of heavy bond paper bore the embossed seal of the county court. It was a formal notice for a guardianship hearing scheduled for Wednesday morning, less than 12 hours after the conclusion of the city's annual charity gala. The paper vibrated in her hands, the black ink of the court stamp looking like a fresh bruise. Graham had timed it with the precision of a watchmaker. He would have his night of public adoration, appearing as the devoted husband to a struggling wife. And then, before the sun rose the next day, he would legally erase her. In the grand living room, the smell of expensive coffee mingled with the scent of furniture polish. Dr. Hampton sat in a deep wing-back chair, his leather briefcase resting across his knees like a shield. He didn't look at Megan, not really. His gaze merely skimmed over her pale face as if she were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. Graham stood by the cold fireplace, his tall frame casting a shadow that blotted out the morning sun from Megan's lap. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, aggressive scratch of a fountain pen across a medical form. Hampton didn't ask a single question, didn't perform a single test. He simply listened to Graham's low, concerned narration of Megan's delusions. When the pen lifted, Graham took the paper, a formal diagnosis of progressive paranoid schizophrenia, and tucked it into his breast pocket with a small, satisfied nod. The sound of keys clashing together was sharp and violent in the quiet hallway. Megan stood in the center of her bedroom, watching as Graham moved from door to door on the second floor. He wasn't just checking locks. He was sealing her in. The click of the deadbolt on the library, then the guest suite, and finally the study, echoed like a series of gunshots. He turned to her, leaning against the doorframe of the master bedroom, the heavy silver ring of keys dangling from his index finger. "The wandering stops now, Megan," he said, his voice as cold as the marble in the foyer. "You're clearly not fit to be left to your own devices." He stepped back and pulled the door shut, the final turn of the key vibrating through the wood and into Megan's very bones. Megan dropped to her knees on the plush rug, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She reached under the heavy oak dresser, her fingers searching the dust-filmed floor until they hit the cold, sleek plastic of the hidden tablet. She pulled it out, her thumb hovering over the power button, a silent prayer on her lips. The screen flickered to life, reflected in her wide, desperate eyes. But the folders she had spent weeks filling were gone. The cloud storage icon flashed a red error message. Graham had found the digital trail. He had remotely wiped her backups, leaving her with nothing but a glowing, empty screen. The physical weight of the loss hit her in the chest. The evidence of his theft, the recordings of his threats, all vanished into the ether. She slumped against the bedside table, her head resting on the cold wood. Her gaze fell on the gold-embossed invitation for the night's gala, lying among her discarded lotions. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the fine print of the evening's program with a sudden, desperate focus. Keynote presentation, Graham Caldwell. Digital integration provided by Skylink Cloud Services. A spark of heat flared in her chest. If Graham was using Skylink for his live presentation, he would have to open a direct, unencrypted bridge to his primary server from the ballroom's terminal. It was a security flaw he would normally never allow. But for the sake of a seamless, high-tech display of his charity, he would be vulnerable. For 20 minutes, his entire digital life would be tethered to a public stage. The bedroom door opened, and Graham stepped in, carrying a garment bag that hissed as it moved. He draped the navy silk dress over a chair and turned to Megan, a tall glass of water in one hand and 2 large white tablets in the other. "We have a long night ahead, and I won't have you making a scene," he said, stepping into her space. The bitter, medicinal scent of the concentrated tranquilizers filled her nose as he pressed the glass toward her lips. He wasn't asking. He stood over her, his shadow engulfing her, until she took the pills into her mouth. He watched her throat move as she swallowed, his expression one of clinical satisfaction, as if he were finally taming a wild animal. Megan felt the grit of the undissolved pills against the back of her tongue, but she forced a swallow of the lukewarm water. Graham nodded, turning his back to her to check his reflection in the full-length mirror, adjusting the silk knot of his tie. In that split second, Megan pressed her hand to her mouth and coughed the tablets into her palm. She moved with a silent, feline grace, sliding the white discs deep into the thick wool of the rug beneath the bed frame. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she kept her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on Graham's broad shoulders. She took a deep breath, tasting the copper of fear and the salt of her own resolve, while he smoothed the lapels of his tuxedo, oblivious to the small act of defiance beneath his feet. As the minutes ticked by, Megan allowed her eyelids to droop, her body sagging into the armchair. When Graham called her name to begin getting ready, She waited 3 seconds before responding, her voice a thick, slurred imitation of a woman lost in a chemical fog. She let her head loll slightly to the side, her gaze unfocused as she looked past him. Graham stepped close, gripping her chin with a firm, bruising pressure, turning her face toward the light to inspect her pupils. Megan let her jaw go slack, her eyes glazed and vacant. He let out a short, mocking laugh, convinced that his chemistry had finally achieved what his words could not. He turned away to gather her shoes, and Megan watched him through the veil of her lashes, the cold fire of her hatred burning brighter than ever. The ballroom of the Grand Asheville Hotel was a cavern of gold leaf and shimmering crystal, the air thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. Megan felt Graham's hand tighten on her arm as they stepped through the heavy oak doors. The flashbulbs of the waiting press were a barrage of white light, stinging her eyes and turning the room into a fragmented kaleidoscope of black tuxedos and silk gowns. Graham's fingers bit into the soft flesh of her forearm, masked by the navy silk of her sleeve, a silent reminder of the leash he held. He steered her forward with a predatory grace, his smile radiant and practiced for the cameras. Megan kept her chin high, her face a mask of fragile, drugged compliance, while every nerve in her body screamed at the touch of the man who planned to disappear her by dawn. "Graham, I need some water," Megan whispered, her voice a perfect, thready imitation of exhaustion. She leaned her weight slightly against him, letting her knees buckle just enough to look convincing. Graham's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the room to see if anyone had noticed her stumble. He let out an annoyed breath, glancing toward the bar. "Don't move from this spot," he hissed, his voice a low vibration near her ear. As soon as his hand left her arm, Megan straightened. She didn't head for the seats. She slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain near the stage. The air back here was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. She moved through the shadows of the backstage area, her heels silent on the heavy cables snaking across the floor, until she found the glowing blue lights of the Central Skylink terminal. Her hands moved with a frantic, precise speed she didn't know she possessed. She pulled a slim USB cable from the hidden pocket of her dress and tethered her phone to the terminal. The screen of the master computer flickered, demanding an administrative override. Megan entered the string of characters Ellen had provided, a back door into Graham's proprietary encryption. On the monitor, a progress bar appeared, filling with a toxic green light as it bypassed the firewalls. The electronic locks gave way, and suddenly, Graham's entire digital world was splayed across the screen. She saw the folders: Project Shell, Offshore Cayman, Trust Liquid, and began dragging them into the gala's presentation queue, her skin crawling from the cold metal of the terminal. The sound of applause, muffled by the curtain, signaled Graham's arrival on stage. Megan watched through a sliver in the velvet as he approached the mahogany podium, the spotlight turning his hair to silver. His voice, amplified to a godlike roar by the ballroom sound system, was smooth and full of a manufactured warmth. He spoke of legacy and the responsibility of the fortunate, his hands moving in graceful, practiced arcs. Behind him, the massive LED screen remained dark, waiting for the signal to begin his curated display of charts and graphs. Megan stood in the gloom of the wings, her thumb hovering over the final command on the terminal, watching the man she had once loved prepare to lie to the world one last time. With a sharp, decisive strike of the Enter key, Megan launched the file. Behind Graham, the screen didn't display the expected charts of charitable growth. Instead, it flickered and erupted into a scrolling wall of raw data. The names of shell companies flashed in 10-foot-tall letters, followed by a series of ledger entries showing the systematic draining of Megan's personal trust fund. The ballroom went deathly silent. Graham continued speaking for a few seconds, his back to the screen, until he noticed the guests in the front row leaning forward, their faces pale with confusion and shock. He turned, his confident smile freezing, as he saw his own signature on a series of forged offshore transfer documents, illuminated for everyone to see. Megan reached for the master audio fader and slammed it upward. A new sound filled the ballroom, drowning out the ambient hum of the crowd. It was a recording, grainy, but unmistakably Graham's voice. "You're going to the clinic, Megan. I've already paid Hampton to sign the papers. You'll be in a padded room by morning, and no one will ever hear your voice again." The cold, sadistic hiss of his words echoed off the marble walls, stripping away the last of his carefully constructed mask. Graham spun around, his face turning a sickly, ashen gray in the glare of the LED screen. He reached for the microphone, his movements jerky and panicked. But the sound of his own laughter at Megan's helplessness continued to roar from the speakers. The silence that followed the recording was more violent than a scream. Megan stepped out from behind the curtain, the navy silk of her gown shimmering under the stage lights. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an executioner. She walked toward the center of the stage, her gaze locked onto Graham's. He looked small now, huddled behind the podium as the flashes of the press cameras turned into a frenzied strobe light. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin one last lie, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Megan stopped just a foot away from him, the air between them vibrating with the weight of her victory. And for the first time in 10 years, she was the one who didn't blink. Graham bolted. He leapt from the stage, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses that shattered like ice against the floor. He ran for the side exit, his tuxedo jacket flapping behind him, but the heavy oak doors were already being held shut. 3 men in dark suits, police officers Ellen had coordinated with, stepped into his path. The sound of metal on metal, the sharp, dry ratcheting of handcuffs, was the loudest sound Megan had ever heard. Graham struggled, his face contorted into a mask of pure, impotent rage. His silk tie pulled askew. As they led him through the crowded ballroom, the red and blue lights of the patrol cars outside began to pulse against the tall windows, signaling the end of his reign. Megan didn't watch them take him away. She turned to the lead detective, her hands finally beginning to shake. She reached into the hidden seam of her dress, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp skin of her waist, and pulled out a small, folded packet of papers. It was the original ledger of Graham's payments to Dr. Hampton, documents she had recovered from the study months ago and kept physically on her person for this exact moment. The detective took the papers, his latex gloves rustling as he inspected the Razmashisti signature of her husband. Megan looked at the detective, her eyes clear and cold, and felt the invisible noose that had been tightening around her neck for a decade finally dissolve into nothing. 3 weeks later, the Asheville mansion was a hollow shell of its former self. Megan stood in the center of the kitchen, the air smelling of pine cleaner and emptiness. She picked up a heavy silver pen and signed the final documents, transferring the estate and its contents to the bank to settle the massive debts Graham had hidden behind his shell companies. She didn't want the house. She didn't want the memories. She took the heavy ring of keys and placed them on the cold marble of the kitchen island. The sound of the metal hitting the stone echoed through the silent hallways. She picked up her single suitcase, took one last look at the panoramic windows that had been her prison bars, and walked out the front door without looking back. The new apartment was small, located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where the only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of birds. Megan turned the key in the lock, the simple click feeling like a symphony of freedom. The air inside smelled of fresh paint and possibilities. She carried a box of books to the built-in shelves, texts on adolescent psychology, trauma recovery, and career counseling. She took the first volume and slid it into place, her fingers lingering on the spine. She wasn't the same woman who had lived on the hill. She was someone forged in the fire of her own survival. She sat by the open window, the afternoon sun warming her face, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to ask for permission to breathe.